understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How are you doing there? I am speaking to you from, and John, the podcast is coming from Glasgow, where I have been for the last 48 hours. And I must admit, John, I really am impressed by this city. It's one...
You're looking remarkably fresh for being in Glasgow for 48 hours.
I know. Well, okay, the first thing is I came here, I'm sitting in a hotel opposite BBC Scotland, and I came here because the BBC, which is great, they have a thing on Radio 4, a really serious program called Book of the Week.
Yes,
and they have chosen money for being their Book of the Week for, I think, in about 2 weeks' time, which is a big, big deal.
Do you remember we were talking the last time, and it was interesting how they were going to abridge it, how they were going to edit it?
Yes, so basically the BBC pick the bits. They read the book, and then they say, okay, we want this as Book of the Week, and then somebody in the BBC reads the book, and then they abridge it themselves. They take out the bits that they like of it and
dump all the stuff that they don't.
Yeah. We didn't like that. But anyway, so that was that. That was all day yesterday. And then this morning, of course, I went out last night to Finiston. And thank you very much for listeners of the podcast for giving me a couple of very fine recommendations.
Nice.
Very fine recommendations. In fact, you will enjoy this, John. I walked into a bar called the Park Bar last night on Argyle Street in Finiston.
Right.
And I was at the bar and a fella came up to me and he said, "You're David McWilliams. I listen to your podcast." Scottish guy.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
So that was great. That was great. Anyway, so thank you very much, listeners, for all your salubrious and thankfully not so salubrious suggestions, and some not so salubrious ones that will remain secret, but they were fantastic little spots. And then, of course, this morning I got up at 8 a.m. and I did a walking tour. I did a 10-mile walking tour. You would have loved it, right?
Yeah.
And I'm just going to give a shout out to Jill at Up and About Scotland, who is the name of the walking tour company. And that's when I began. Last night I was like, God, this is fun. These are great restaurants and bars. It's got a vibe. It's got an energy. It's got lots of people around it. But this morning, in the very cold light of day, and it is cold, right?
Yeah.
It's a beautiful sunny morning. I walked around the city and it's majestic. It's statuesque. It's kind of monumental. The architecture here betokens or underscores a city with extraordinary ambition about 100 years ago.
Right.
It's that lovely Scottish kind of, they call it blonde sandstone, and it looks beautiful. And of course, the fascinating thing is half of all the old monuments are black as soot. Why? Because this was a massive coal town for years. Yeah. So you see the contrast between some of the buildings they've actually cleaned up and some of the buildings that remain the same. But I've been walking around, so it's been fascinating. And then, of course, what intrigued me, John, was this idea of the Scottish Enlightenment. Like what actually happened in this country to propel it in the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries to being such a center of knowledge, of industry, of philosophy. And of course, you know, the father of macroeconomics, Adam Smith, had a chair at Glasgow University, which is just up the road here.
Yeah.
And it's the idea of all that. So this has been intriguing me. So we're going to be all Scottish. And it goes as a genuflection to my grandparents, who came from a place called Helensburgh, which is down the Clyde from here. But their parents came, as we said, from the islands, from the Hebrides. So it's been a sort of a little bit of a homecoming, you know? And there are a hell of a lot of Redsers up here, far more than even in Ireland. So I tell you what, on this basis, let's talk Scotland with the brilliant Mark Blythe, Professor of Political Economy at Brown University in the United States, but one of the best communicators of economics on the planet. So let's go and talk to Mark about Scotland, the Enlightenment, the economics here, the history, and where Scotland goes from here. Mark, how are you? Great to see you.
That's good to see you as well, David.
Mark, now I want to talk about Glasgow, Scotland, in this podcast, but I really want to get my head around this idea of the Scottish Enlightenment. Because what fascinates me is why a certain country becomes a magnet for ideas, for capital, for intellectualism, for curious immigrants, etc., for a certain while, and
Yeah.
then that stops. And Scotland in the 18th century was that place. Tell me what was going on. Explain to me, what is the Scottish Enlightenment? Who were the major players? What it did? And what happened to it?
Right. Well, the last time I taught a class on this was 10 years ago, so bear with me on this, right? All right. So what was it? It was part of the general kind of intellectual ferment of the latter half of the 18th century. It's really focused on France. When we think of the Renaissance, right, we think of Italy and we think of Galileo, etc. Then there's the spillover of this into the religious wars around this period, etc. And then there's this kind of like moment that happens, the Société de Belles Lettres, etc. Diderot, the encyclopedia, the post-revolutionary and pre-revolutionary intellectual ferment of France. All the Scots are drawn into this, right? They're all part of this. Adam Smith used to go every summer and hang out in France, right? So many of the people who are members of the Scottish Enlightenment, David Hume, Adam Ferguson, etc., these are the people that are basically going out, hanging out in France, talking to the so-called physiocrat economists, having their disagreements with them, etc. In terms of leading figures, two most central ones are probably David Hume. So
Yep.
David Hume, sort of empiricist, basically a philosophy that says there's no such thing as innate properties to matter, which gets him in a lot of trouble with ecclesiastical authorities. And essentially all we have is our senses. This leads to modern empiricism. If I can't touch it, taste it, feel it, kick it around the playground, it's not real, I'm not interested in it, etc. That's a bit of an injustice to the richness of Hume, but like we'll go with it, right?
Let's go with it.
That's
yep.
fine, right? And then on the other side, the other anchor figure, of course, is Adam Smith with The Wealth of Nations, right? Now, what happens with this? It's essentially sort of, and this is where I'd like to go with it because I think it's important. How do you get these moments? You get these moments when societies grow and they
Yes.
grow rapidly, right? So it's really important to get the background of this, right? So what you end up with by the time that you get to about the 1780s is a society of literally Presbyterian churches who are kind of the intellectual elite, Masonic lodges, reading societies, quasi offshoots of the Royal Society, that sort of like scientific meets literary sort of societies, and then sort of a rebirth of a literary culture and a rediscovery of its literary culture. Now, how does all this happen? Go back almost about 80 years. Scotland goes bankrupt trying to build the Panama Canal.
Now, I didn't know that. Explain
Not
that
many
one to
people
me.
know this. This is hilarious. So down the road from where I live in Providence, Rhode Island, you take a train about 2 hours and you get to Darien, Connecticut. Darien, Connecticut has the highest concentration of hedge fund professionals in the world, right? And this is hilarious because they don't know the name of the town. It's named after the Darien Project. That's when the Scottish elites decided, hey, lads, I've got a good one. Why don't we build about 40 ships, throw about 6,000 people on it, bugger off to what is modern-day Panama with pickaxes and shovels, and dig a canal to connect the world. And if we do that, we can sit there as a toll booth and just collect the rents. Great idea, except everybody died of the Spanish and malaria. Then, in a Monty Python-esque thing, they said, right, we failed once, let's do it again. At the end of this, they'd spanked about 40% of national treasures, and the place was bankrupt. There was famine. So when the Act of Union comes along, this is in the late 1600s, and then you get the Act of Union 1707, the place is knackered, right? You've got a fifth of the population, but your economy is only the 12th. But the Act of Union itself, joining a bigger market, all the rest of it, right, really starts to grow the economy of Scotland. You begin to get the clearances, you begin to get better agricultural practices, etc. And over a very short period of time, Edinburgh starts to become quite rich. And Glasgow starts to become quite rich because of the triangle trade, right? So this is basically where you're shipping out slaves. Those slaves are making sugar. The sugar's going to America, and then the sugar is getting exchanged for tobacco, and that's coming back to Glasgow, which is going out into England and into France, etc., and then rinse and repeat. This builds the merchant city in Glasgow. And then on the other side of it with Edinburgh, you begin to get the banking and finance institutions, which are growing up on the back of this. So short, a long-winded answer to your original question, how do you get societies like this? How do you get these moments of intellectual ferment? You got to be able to afford them. And you can afford them when you have above normal growth for an extended period. That's Ireland.
That's Ireland right now, but we're going to get on to Ireland in a couple of minutes, right? Let's come back to Scotland, right? So the Scottish Enlightenment is an economic idea. It's a philosophical idea. You mentioned agriculture. It's an agricultural idea in terms of extraordinary inventiveness in yield management, etc.
Mhm.
It is a geological idea. It is you've the beginning of physics, then you go on
Yep.
to biology. So it's not just limited to a
No,
small
absolutely.
strain. It's a very broad-based sort of intellectual revolution in a small country.
Yes, but it's also more, and the French, in a sense, do the philosophical and sort of arty version of this. What you start to get the spillover, particularly with the rise of the sort of gentleman scientist cult in England and Scotland, is sort of people like Boyle, right? People like
Yes.
Black, who begin to basically figure out what gases are and how they work and volume and pressure and all this sort of stuff. You get the steam engine. This, of course, comes out of this moment as well. King's College, which is now Strathclyde University, is the home for a lot of this early technology. So it's a technological revolution that's built on that as well. How do you get technological revolutions? You have surplus capital, right? You're rich enough to experiment, right? So again, it goes back to the fact that it comes back on this period of growth.
And explain to me why Scotland is proximate to France in the way England wasn't.
Because that was the old alliance. That
Okay.
essentially so Scotland had always been divided between the sort of the clans in the north, which are a bit of a sort of construct. But basically there's a kind of northern economy, which is, pre-literate, family organized, clannish, etc., etc. And then you have the much more settled lowlands. The much more settled lowlands had lots of trading ties across the North Sea and also down into France. And there was a lot of intellectual and family links between the Scottish nobility and also the French. So that was a long-standing thing. Plus, of course, the French from time to time loved to piss off the English. So they could always do that by essentially, bankrolling the Scots a little bit. So that went on for quite some time.
And so if you think about like the French Enlightenment comes to a shuddering conclusion in the French Revolution.
Yes.
Why didn't the Scottish Enlightenment lead to dramatic political change in Scotland?
Well, exactly the growth question. Again, Scotland was going, France was going bankrupt. What happened to Scotland 2 generations earlier with Darien was essentially the motive force behind the French Revolution. So, it's the famous let them eat cake, etc., etc. So when you have that degree of polarization, when you have basically a collapsing economy, a massive ongoing fiscal crisis because of the largesse of the state, Scotland doesn't have this. Scotland is also, and this is something that Gordon Brown has pointed out many times, is that Scotland managed to export its elites straight into the sinews of English power. Right from the
Explain
beginning.
that to me. Well, Gordon Brown being one of the great
Right,
latter-day
exactly.
examples.
There's a lot of examples, right? So right from the start, there was a strong integration of particularly the Act of Union 1707. By the time that you get to the end of that century, Scotland has 5 universities, England has 2.
See, that's an amazing statistic.
We have our own separate ecclesiastical setup. We got our own laws, etc. So the lawyers, etc., stay in Edinburgh, but a lot of the political elite understand where the money is and where the power is, and it's also in London. And also, if you're going to run this triangle trade out to Virginia and North Carolina, etc., that's going to be part to do with what the London merchant classes are doing. So there's a sort of correspondence between these elites. So the Scottish elite that used to go to France, right, that pretty much dies in the Jacobin period, except in the intellectual classes, like Smith, for example, going almost every summer to France, right? But the power elite basically migrated down to London. So this is when you get people like Boswell and others who are like back and forth all the time. And that's how you get that sort of thing that Gordon's pointed out, whereby Scotland punches above its weight in the sense that a bit like Ireland in the modern EU, right? Ireland holds way more key positions in the EU than it should by population. Scotland was exactly the same as the British Empire was beginning to really flourish.
Okay, so this is a fascinating question again, because I am in Glasgow and I'm walking around. This is a monumental city. It's a city that you can really see was the second city of the British Empire, no doubt, and you can really feel that. Can you explain to me? So 1707, you have the Act of Union, and the Scots begin to profit enormously from the British trade routes that the English then allowed the Scots to play in, which they were prior to that weren't allowed to play in, right?
Correct.
We have an Act of Union in 1801. Ireland has a totally different experience with the Act of Union than Scotland does. Explain to me what's kind of going on in Scotland that maybe wasn't going on in Ireland. And I don't expect you to have a full palette of Irish history, but your general sense, the political history sort of sense of the whole thing.
Well, part of it is when you're building modern capitalism, you kind of have to create 3 key commodities. So the first one is capital. That is sort of fungible wealth that you can do stuff with. And the other one is land, right? You have to be able to buy and sell land. and the other one is labor, right? We're not all born with a price tag on our head. You have to make peasants into workers. And there were certain ways in which the way this drove Scotland was in the commodification of land. You got the Highland clearances. And this is basically people being thrown off the land. They become without land holdings. If they're lucky, they make it to a boat and maybe get to Canada or America, right? That's part of what happens in Ireland. Ireland is essentially seen as sort of right for land clearance. And that's what you get there, which is also what you get in the Scottish Highlands. Scottish lowlands had always been different. Patterns of agriculture have been different, patterns of production have been different, and they were much more attuned to making it into the sort of the mercantile revolution first and the industrial revolution second. So if you're in Glasgow and you're on Argyll Street, the rail tracks that go into the station at Central Station that come from over the River Clyde is called the Highlanders Umbrella, because people from the Highlands that would come down were looking for jobs in the factories back in the 1840s, 1850s, would congregate under there because that was the place you could get out of the rain. So the patterns of settlement become much different, because in Scotland, what you have is a full-blown industrial revolution. As you say, the second city of empire, right? Ireland wasn't set up that way. Ireland was essentially set up, if it was set up at all, as a kind of afterthought / agricultural colony for the UK, rather than seen as an integral part of the industrial growth model, if you put it in modern terms. I would think about it that way.
And just another thing on Scotland, which is always interested me. I want to come back to sectarianism and all that stuff. You know,
all the fun stuff.
Yeah, you're talking about the Highland clearances. You're talking about people from the Highlands coming into Glasgow at the same time. You're talking about the people escaping the famine in Ireland coming in and around the same period. So you've got this cauldron of migrants, of landless people, of desperate people trying to settle, as you said, under the Argyll Bridge there. No, but just before we get to that, explain to me why Scotland embraced the Reformation in the way it did, when it did, and in the guise that it became. Because that, again, is weird, because Scotland's a long, long way from Geneva.
Yes. It's a really good question. I'm not sure I have a good answer to it, and I'm not sure anybody really has a good answer to it. Perhaps Billy Connolly has the best answer to it, because Billy Connolly did a whole gag about this once, which basically boils down to, right, I've come back from Geneva, lads, and I've got this whole new philosophy. What's that? First off, no fun. Secondly, you're all doomed. Right? How did that possibly take place in Scotland?
Exactly.
Well, I know, no, it's a really interesting question. I mean, part of it is sort of the specifics of agency, that you have John Knox going out to Geneva, who's a Presbyterian preacher, Calvinist preacher. And he comes back and he's sort of completely convinced of double predestination, the core of the Calvinist faith. And there's something about that. And you can tell this story, right? I'd be happy to tell this story. I have no idea whether it's true, but it kind of makes sense, right?
Don't worry. We've told far worse.
Your yarns are of legend. So the German sociologist Max Weber, right? He has this famous thesis about Protestantism and capitalism. And his basic idea is that once you have a bunch of Protestants together, they are all basically concerned with not doing anything ostentatious and being busy all the time. And if you do that, you're going to end up with a pile of savings. And if you end up with a pile of savings, what do you do with it? Do you go out and blow it all on hookers and coke? No, you don't do that. What you do is you save even more of it. So you end up with this giant pool of capital, which ends up funding, if you will, modern capitalism, right? I think something very similar happens in Scotland, that Calvinism comes in at a moment when the ecclesiastical authority of the church, the traditional church, is very much broken. It is a Protestant settlement, right? Catholicism's on the way out and is very contested, right? I like to say that my family is the 6% of Catholics that weren't threw into the sea during the Reformation.
So it's the embracing, because the reason I've just walked up past the necropolis here in Glasgow, and there's a massive big statue of our friend John Knox. Exactly. And then you have all these St. Andrew's Church, and you've the kirk.
Exactly.
I just walked by a beautiful little church called the Whistling Kirk, which I love, which was when the Presbyterians banned all musical instruments because they're great crack, because they're such fun, right?
Really? Wow.
They banned all musical instruments anywhere, let alone the churches.
They sound like the Taliban.
They were 100% the
Taliban, yeah.
And there's there's a wee kirk beside Glasgow Green that I just passed by on my little stroll there a minute ago, and it was called the Whistling Kirk because for some reason, the Presbyterians in this kirk decided to put a little organ in there, almost a secret organ. They were going to break away. They were certainly more Al-Qaeda than the Taliban, these guys. They were a little bit more objective. And
they were the organic Presbyterians, sorry.
You had to do that one. Anyway, the long and the short was, but again, I'm walking around this city and it has a profoundly Calvinistic, not feeling, but
No, it's
sort
an
of
undertone.
It's
an
a legacy.
undertone.
It's like a
Yeah,
legacy.
I totally get it. So just to finish off that thought, I mean, essentially, there's a big period with ecclesiastical authorities and very much in flux. In comes Knox. Knox basically rallies the troops and basically sets up Geneva and Edinburgh. It doesn't sort of transmit right across the country by any means, but it gives a sort of like a different order and different caste to Scottish Protestantism that you get in the rest of the country. Right, Church of England and Scottish Presbyterianism, Protestantism, very, very different things. But once the sort of the religious ferment element gets out of this and it becomes a legacy, you get, for example, Hume being very much in trouble with the church and the ecclesiastical courts and all that sort of stuff. But by the time you get about 50 years past this, what you've got is a kind of community that behave very much like Max Weber's Protestants, where it's not about ostentatious shows of wealth. It's about basically, as Adam Smith put it in The Wealth of Nations, betterment of your condition to be well regarded by your peers, right? So it's a very sort of like, keep it down, lads. It's not about the fun. It's about basically building the community and building wealth. That was the way that it filtered through.
Okay, so let's just that was the story of Scotland in the, let's say, the trade era.
Aye.
Because it's very clear to me there's two eras here. One is you open up, it's a mercantilist wealth, it's trading, it's based lots of on slavery, lots of on tobacco, lots of on what we call this Atlantic triangle between the UK, Africa, and colonies in America. Into the 19th century, the Argyle Bridge story is the massive industrialization. So this is also not so much unprecedented, but this is what makes Glasgow really, really powerful.
Oh, yeah. By the time you get to the 1850s, I once saw a figure that 40% of the rolling stock and around 40% of all shipping in the world was coming off the Clyde.
Wow.
Right. Amazing. Absolutely huge. I think at one point there were I think it's something like 70 different shipyards at one point.
Well, you can really see it. You can see it here just on the Clyde as you walk down. I mean, first of all, the river is magnificent. And secondly, the river is entirely artificial. That's what I love.
Yes.
It's entirely the construct of weirs and sluices and dams. Again, a feat of enormous engineering.
Absolutely. And it's funny. I mean, I just reflect on things just now and you think there's Rachel Reeves telling us, we've got no money to fix the tear in the sofa.
I know.
And you've got this society that's just like, well, we'll just mobilize enormous amounts of capital and just transform nature without even thinking about it. The scale of the ambition is just something that we don't see anymore. It's incredible in that regard.
Well, this is the fascinating. This is the kind of economic historian in me kind of sits back and sits on a little chair, looking at the Clyde, imagining the people who built it, the people who took the risks, and then, of course, the laborers who actually dug the navies. And this comes to the history of the Irish in this part of the world.
Right.
Okay? Not just the Irish, the Highlanders as well, right?
Yeah, totally.
But the poor people who built it. Give me a flavor of that history. Does the Irish start to come around the famine, or is it just before the famine?
I think there's two waves. And again, my history on this is a little bit dodgy. But the largest wave, I believe, came post 1860, 1870. A lot of it had to do with literally importing labor to basically lower the price of labor, get rid of quasi-unions in the shipyards. So one of the reasons that sort of the whole thing got politicized, Catholic, Protestant, the settlement of Irish in East Glasgow as opposed to the West End, Celtic Rangers, all this sort of stuff, comes down to the fact that basically, as usual, capitalists were importing cheap labor to try and keep the prices down and keep the profits up. And one of the ways that they did this by incorporating the shipyards and other ancillary trades was to basically create sort of social clubs, etc., which became religiously exclusive. An identity basically of Scots and Irish
clubs.
And turned into football clubs and all this sort of stuff. So essentially there is a sort of strong economic history story behind this. The best book on this, if you ever want to read it, is a guy called Michael Hechter. And it's called Internal Colonialism. It was done in 1976. And he points out that Scotland is very weird because Scotland, in a sense, was the first colony. But it was also a voluntary colony because it came about through active union. And it was a colony that ended up being more developed than the metropole in many ways. So at its height, second city of empire, etc., this is really the workshop for the world. That's where the phrase comes from. So it's a very peculiar form of colonialism, whereby what happens is rather than sort of you go off somewhere, they've got something you want, you build a railway, you pull it out and you abuse the natives. What you do is you pour billions and billions into capital into shipbuilding, into steel, into everything. And what happens over time is, of course, that like wages begin to rise. And when wages begin to rise, you need more laborers. So where do you find them? You find them in Ireland. So then you start to bring them over. And some of that blends okay, but some of it doesn't. There's also, I mean, to switch to my family, right? My mother's side of the family is actually Irish Catholic, right?
I
and
knew
they
you were
came
good.
over in the 1870s. I know there had to be some good in me somewhere. But the other half of us really was the sort of the people the Presbyterians couldn't find because we were hiding under the stairs and we couldn't be drowned in the sea, right? So there was a sort of, particularly in the northeast coast of Scotland, there's a sort of fragmentary Catholicism which has remained, of which the Irish were seen as very different. So in my grandmother's period, right, honestly, even though these people are all working class people, right, there was an implicit assumed hierarchy that the West Coast Irish weren't sort of us, the East Coast Catholics. There was some, our shit smelt better in some regards.
Just on that issue, the Catholics in the northeast, is that why the Liberal Democrats are quite strong up there?
Oh, I've never thought about that, David. That's a really good idea. It might be. It could also be the legacy of sort of what's called the Free Church, which is more on the West Coast as well, where they sometimes get a foothold, which is kind of a breakaway from the sort of the Presbyterian mainstream. But once you get into sort of like, you know, Presbyterian sectarianism, it's, you know, no one can make sense of that. It's just completely
No. It's what I love about being in Northern Ireland, where you have the, you know, I have family members who are members of the 5th Presbyterian Church, and I'm thinking, what happened to the other 4? No, because my family history is the opposite. We came from Scotland, went to Ireland. So it's kind of an unusual sort of pattern. But let's come back then to Scotland, 20th century, right? Mm-hmm. To the decline of Scotland, to the sense that we're in Glasgow, although I love it and it's vibrant, it's energetic. You can sense that this once was something and now is trying to reinvent into something else.
Yeah.
How steep is the decline and how quickly does it happen? And the reason I say this is I've got Ireland in the back of my head all the time. Present day Ireland is wealthy, full of money, full of capital. It doesn't have half the ambition that we see in our friends on the Clyde here of rediverting nature, as you say, and reimagining where they are in the world. But I want to talk about the severity of the decline of Scotland, particularly in the 20th century, and then we talk a wee bit about it now.
Mm-hmm. So when does the decline begin? The first stage of the decline is really general British decline. So Britain peaks essentially just before World War I. America's already bigger by that point, but is largely self-contained. They're not sort of a global power. And what you begin to get with World War I is just a huge spanking of resources. So, you know, 40% of the treasury is just done. Then you come back in the 1920s, you try and get back in the gold standard, it's massively deflationary. That's another like massive hit that you get. So Scotland's basically getting buffeted by the same stuff that everybody else is in the first half of the 20th century, which is basically a pretty crap time. When you get to sort of what Europe calls, you know, in various ways, the sort of the great years after the post-war era, right? So the Wirtschaftswunder, the Italians call it Il Boom, which I totally adore. The French have the Trente Glorieuses, right? The 30 great years, right? So Scotland kind of misses out on this. Because to take my hometown an example, Dundee, right? By some estimates, Dundee might be the first place to deindustrialize because our major industry was jute.
It's quite an accolade.
That certainly is, isn't it? We were first in this one. But the
we were
big
first to be shit.
And shitification was us. That's it. So what did we do? We had jute fiber coming out of places like West Bengal, part of the empire. We would turn that into basically Hessian-type packaging, and then that's what everything got bundled with. Two things happen. The empire gets kicked, and the second one is the Americans invent nylon. So right at that point in time, like, boom, you start to see the decline. So then there's another set of decline, which is one that hits Glasgow in particular, which is the shipyards. Essentially, you get low-cost competitors, particularly South Korea and others, really beginning to take over the global shipping industry. We can't really support that. The government basically is trying to manage this and reinvigorate it, but doesn't really invest enough and doesn't know quite what to do. You end up with all these nationalized industries, think British Leyland making shit cars nobody wanted, et cetera, right? And
except for my dad.
Did you? Oh yeah, I think mine might have been. Do you remember? Do you remember the Austin Princess?
You had one, Mac.
We had one. John remembers that.
This was
the worst car in the world,
and it was beige as well.
I know it looked like a door wedge.
And
if I remember right, it had a 1.7 liter Marina engine in it, so it was this thing that looked like a door wedge that was about as fast as a sort of like dead cat. They were horrible. Anyway, basically along comes Thatcherism, and this is blow number 3 because Thatcher just goes, we're not going to do this anymore. And we're just going to basically let it all go to hell, and then, you know, entrepreneurs will pick it up. Well, if only that's what happens. Because certain things get picked up, like finance gets picked up in London, and then certain things become growth nodes again. New technologies begin to emerge, like biotech. Think about what's happened to Cambridge, the south of England with that. Dundee, for example, the university becomes a bit of an anchor because of it's very good at sort of biotech and medicine, right? So the universities become anchors, this sort of stuff. But much of the traditional stuff that people did, manufacturing in one way or another, simply dies. And for bigger places, to me, one of my personal markers of how a place is doing is not the Big Mac index or any of that bollocks. It's how many international flights you have direct to other destinations. And if you go to Edinburgh, you'll find it's got a lot, or you can fly to like 4 or 5 places in the States, all over the continent. It's not just the sort of budget airlines, right? You go to Glasgow, there's not as many of those things, not as many direct links. A lot more of the budget tourism stuff comes out of Glasgow. What have you got in Glasgow? You still have engineering, right? You still got that. You still got the anchor of the 2 big universities. But a lot of the traditional stuff that a lot of the working classes did have gone and hasn't been replaced. You've got that classic thing of like shit jobs in the service sector, right? I used to work in the shipyards, now I work in ASDA, right? Yeah. Aggregate that out, what's going to happen, right? Places like Dundee have been hit much worse because even though you've got things like that, the university as an anchor, you really don't have that much else. I mean, the place has been on decline for a very long time. Conversely, you go to places like Inverness. Inverness is doing really well. A lot of that is to do with tourism, right? But you build other things. All the giant wind farms that you've got off the northeast, right, along with oil, that's what's been keeping Aberdeen going for a long time, right? So, yeah, the decline's been baked in for a long time. Part of it's general economic challenges the West has faced, but Scotland in some ways have managed to basically get punched in the face as many times as possible.
And yet now, for example, the final thing is punch in the face loads of times as possible, get the opportunity in the indie ref to go independent. I think probably one of the very few countries that have ever voted itself out of independence, which is quite an achievement. Why and where is it now? I mean, again, I'm just walking around taking this sort of the McWilliams indicator of, as I called it, John, I just call it, it's kind of walkabout economics, sniffing around, having a walk. In terms of Scotland now, it seems to me that there is so much potential here in this country, and it's untapped.
I think that's correct. And part of the problem is nobody quite knows where the keg tap is right, to actually plug it into, untap it, right? And I'll give you some examples of this. My position on independence has always been one of lifeboat independence. That basically, when I saw Bojo winning an election on the platform of English nationalism, I was like, okay, lifeboat, let's get out, right? We're done, right? But inexorably, the United Kingdom, Scotland likes to say that it's a small northern economy and all this sort of stuff, right? And we're just like, the Scandos. Nothing like it. You're a peripheral part of a medium-sized free trade zone called the United Kingdom. And if your main point is that Brexit was a really bad idea, right? And if Brexit's going to hurt, then undoing 300 years of mutual integration's got to hurt. So the point is not that you can't do it. You got to be really honest and clear-eyed about what the costs are. Now, there's many things that Scotland could do that Scotland would never do. And I'll give you one example of this, right? So one of the conversations around the Scottish national share of England's debt, if you want to put it that way, right? So you want to break off your 8% of the population, you take 8% of the debt, it's whatever billions, there you go, that's it. So let's say that we inherit the same sort of like percentage debt to GDP, which is now in 90% or something like this, right? That's a big debt burden to start off with. And some people are like, well, we can just default. Well, yeah, that's great. Start with a default is always a good way of building a credit rating, right? So let's say you've got this. I can solve this for you really painlessly. There's the Gairloch and the Holy Loch. They were used in the Cold War as nuclear missile bases. You just invite the Yanks back and you charge them basically $5 billion a year for the lease for 50 years. You then take the credit stream from that and you put it straight into the English Treasury and you just use that to basically pay off your share of the debt. So you get the Yanks back for security and you get them to pay off your share of the debt. So de facto you stay off with debt. Well, to do that, you need to actually be a fully fledged member of NATO. You need to have nuclear weapons, all the stuff that people don't want to do. So there are ways of doing this, but in my mind, it would take a generation to get there and it would take a lot of clear-eyed real politics. Unfortunately, we work on a timetable of like, it'll be easy, just vote for me and 5 years from now we'll be living in nirvana. And the economics of that simply don't add up.
Just finally, Scotland, we began with talking about this extraordinary conglomeration of ideas, capital, people, genius, the Enlightenment. When you look at 10 years, do you think there's anything that can change in Scotland, like, for example, the change in Ireland, where the growth rate just accelerates very, very quickly?
So Ireland was both lucky and skillful, right? And both have to be acknowledged. Sort of the opening up phase of the sort of the Celtic Tiger, although that seemed to stall in the 1980s, it really took off in the 1990s. And yes, a large part of it is competitiveness on taxes. And again, as you've said many times, and I fully agree with, if you can't compete on scale, you have to compete on tax, right? So
Yeah.
you can't be a diverse economy. You don't want to be a commodity economy. This is the type of stuff you do. And Alex Salmond, God rest his soul, passed away last week, was very clear about the fact that Scotland would also have to play that type of game. It's not clear to me that the ability to play that game is now there when you have moves towards a global minimum tax for corporations and all this sort of stuff, right? Second thing is the EU was a fabulous project, but if you look at it now, it's in seriously bad repair. It has basically become a sort of a club that regulates. The one way I think about the global economy this way: China makes stuff, America invents stuff, Europe regulates stuff.
That's not good.
That's not good.
That's not
right?
good.
No, and if you want to join the regulation club, I'm not sure what you really get out of that at this point in time, right? So does Scotland have a distinct niche, a distinct business model? Well, again, you have to get away from a lot of the myths that propagate around you. We could be a giant in renewables. Go check who owns them. It's probably BlackRock or a Californian pension fund, right? The whiskey, apparently about a third of it's owned by Selma Hayek's husband.
Well,
right, because he owns the big luxury brand, right?
I had no
that's
idea.
it.
I had
yeah,
no
right,
idea.
exactly, right. So LVMH or whatever they're called, like have a whole host of the top sort of Scottish whiskey brands, right? So are there things that are there? Absolutely, but what it requires is a kind of second Scottish Enlightenment. It needs a bunch of people to get together who really care about this, who have not just sort of short-term electoral goals, but long-term sort of visions as to what this could be, and to sit down and thrash it out and try and mobilize the capital and to try and actually create a deep culture of invention and entrepreneurship that was what the place was once famous for, to actually recapture that, to reinvigorate. That's what it has to be done, and that's the hard work. Because that's not something that you do with, like, we have a 10-point government plan for X, right? Doesn't do it like that. You're talking about getting your universities and your finance classes. I mean, one of the things they did in the Scottish Enlightenment, they had these clubs, and one of them, I think, it might have been called the Political Economy Club or something like that. I can't remember what it was called exactly. And it was designed to bring academics into conversation with the wealth and the merchant city. Right? That's what it was for. Right. So you need those sort of things so that you can then mobilize capital and push it in direction. And of course, you're talking about a place with great natural resources, incredible strategic location. My example about the Americans, every time I see this, people freak out. I'm like, you're living in a world that's increasingly geopolitically unstable. Do you want to be under an American umbrella, or do you want to be on your own and facing the Russians with a fishing boat? Knock yourself in the head here, right? So if you've got that, take advantage of it, right? This is not just a threat, it's an opportunity. And it's that ability to recognize the difference between the two that's been lost.
Mark, as always, an absolute pleasure. Just a tour de force on all things Scottish. Listen, I'm going to talk to you actually on Thursday's podcast about your adopted home, the United States. But for this one, thank you so much. Wonderful, wonderful stuff.
Always a pleasure.
Mark is just outstanding, isn't he?
He's great,
brilliant.
isn't he? Yeah.
And he's a great bass player as well, by all accounts.
Well, I saw you, just so you know, that just before we came on air, Mark was slapping a bass. It was a
Mark
slap
King
bass
style.
movement. Yeah, exactly.
Level 42.
Yeah, you can just sing it there for me.
Yeah.
Sing it there for me. But no, he's a fascinating guy.
There's a couple of things I want to pick up on. One is, you mentioned there was a lot of talk of Geneva there. I wasn't sure if I missed something. What was the connection with Geneva?
So the connection with Geneva is the fact that Scotland went Calvinist. So Geneva was the home of John Calvin, who was a French Huguenot.
Yes.
Who skipped over the border, who was persecuted by the French, skipped over the border to Geneva. And it's to Geneva that a guy called Knox went, and he was the person who brought a form of Protestantism back to Scotland, which was Calvinist, which is the no fun, the no dresses, the no music, the no singing, the no dancing, that very dour form of Presbyterianism, which you see originally in what they call the Scottish Kirk. It's the Scottish Church.
Right.
And of course, that's splintered into the Free Kirk, and they're called the Wee Frees. And they are very, very religious Calvinists. So that's the Calvinist connection.
And of course, ironically, yourself and myself used to go to Knox Hall discos.
You're absolutely right.
Back in the 80s.
So Knox Hall was named after John Knox.
Yeah.
And Knox because it was set up by Presbyterians in Monkstown.
Yeah.
Desecrated by Catholics, it must be said.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We trashed the place.
Set up by Presbyterians and degraded by Catholics.
But the other thing that he was saying, and actually you mentioned in the intro as well, is about the scale of ambition in the 17th, 18th, and particularly the 19th century. And what Mark was saying there is that you just don't see that scale of ambition for growth and for innovation here, particularly in Ireland and Europe.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think where you do see it, and it's a fascinating idea, and that's what we've lost. We've kind of lost our mojo. You see that scale of ambition in China. So the Chinese, have just built, thousands of miles of railroads. Years ago, I was in Shanghai, and you can actually, about 10 years ago, and on the Bund in Shanghai, which is this big sort of very famous walkway, which looks down over on the river and then over to the other side of Shanghai, you can almost feel the city being built.
Yeah.
But it's that ambition they have for infrastructural projects. We don't have this because and this is, of course, what has happened in Europe and particularly in Ireland, and we've talked about it a lot, is we don't have the vision. We don't have the ambition. The political class does not seem to want to risk any sort of electoral disadvantage by disadvantaging people, because in order to actually get something built, you need to move things.
It's the cathedral thinking, and as opposed to the, we're stuck with the 4 or 5 year political cycle here, and that's the big downside of democracy.
It is a huge downside of democracy, and it also is, and it usedn't to be, because it used to be democracy was about getting people together and saying, this is possible and here we move. Now an enormous amount of democracy is about denying people the right to do other things. That's actually, it's not the right for yourself to do things, but denying people the right to do other things. We just don't have this ambition. And of course, a society cannot grow. And I just don't mean GDP growth. I mean, for example, they have a little metro here. They have a subway here, built again 100 years ago. Perfect. Gets you around. It goes a loop. They call it the clockwork orange because it just goes around. It's an orange one that goes around, right? But again, it's somebody built it.
Yeah.
Somebody was discommoded by the building of it, and yet it's here. So, I think we should probably conclude here, John, that what really, really you see is the difference in Glasgow between Glasgow then and Glasgow now is exactly the sort of problems you have about other cities, right? You don't have the ambition.
Yeah.
But also what you don't have, and this is interesting, you don't have what I would call a civically engaged population, right? So they had kind of city fathers and elders here who would actually map out the way in which the city should be run. And there'd be yes, of course, they were obviously elevated people and they were merchants and business people and all that sort of stuff. But they had a sense that, look, we're in this, we can build this, we can do this, and we can create wealth, and that we can then redistribute if we want, or we can actually pay for universities and pay for this, that, and the other. We just don't have that. And instead of that, we have bureaucrats. And bureaucrats, by their very definition, by their very nature, are risk averse. That's why they're bureaucrats. That's why they take those sort of jobs. And the problem with bureaucracies is bureaucracies tend to suffocate growth, ambition, and vision. And once you suffocate growth, ambition, and vision, and this is a problem for Ireland now, because we are in this golden era. If we don't take our chances, John, and build something monumental and do it quickly, we will end up having had a golden age without an enlightenment, which is the problem. At least the Scots had an enlightenment. We'll talk to you Thursday.